Welcome to the Paul Gottschalk Memorial Lecture. I'm Alicia Cohn. In a moment, it's going to be my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Tita Chico, who will be speaking on wonder literature science in the long 18th century. But I also want to thank our audience for being here. Parenthetically, please silence your devices. Before I introduce Professor Chico, I want to first quickly contextualize this lecture. The Gottschalk Memorial Lecture is an endowed lecture established in memory of Paul Gottschalk, professor of English at Cornell, and a scholar of the British Renaissance, and author of The Meanings of Hamlet, published in 1972. Professor Gottschalk died in 1977 at the age of 38. Cornell University, where this is happening, is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So now I want to properly introduce Tita Chico, who is professor of English and faculty director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland. She's the author, most recently, of The Experimental Imagination, Literary Knowledge and Science in the British Enlightenment, which was published by Stanford in 2018. This marvelous monograph challenges the two cultures divide, which postdates the 18th century, by examining how early experimental science was deeply dependent upon literary tropes. Using metaphor to describe the phenomena uncovered by the microscope, telescope, and other technologies of observation, she argues that scientists centrally depended upon imagination, while at the same time, literary writers used scientific metaphors to demonstrate the epistemic authority of trope. She argues that literary knowledge production redefined authority and evidence during this period by presenting the imagination as the ultimate source of truth. Professor Chico is also the author of Designing Women, The Dressing Room in 18th Century Literature and Culture, the editor of an edited collection, Atlantic Worlds in the Long 18th Century, Seduction and Sentiment, and editor of the journal The 18th Century, Theory and Interpretation. She is currently completing a new book on wonder, literature, science in the long 18th century, forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. This book, from which today's lecture is drawn, presents wonder as a defining epistemology for the 18th century and beyond. We'll look forward to questions after the talk, as well as informal conversation to follow. Please welcome Professor Chico.
Hello, thank you so much for that generous introduction, Elisa. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone for taking time out of your day, out of this beautiful day. October is a cruel month in academia, so I really appreciate you taking this, the time and space of mine to join me tonight. I'm very honored to give this lecture. It's so lovely to meet you, Mrs. Gottschalk, in honor of your husband. And the legacies of intellectual inheritances are deep and long, and it's lovely to be a very small part of that. Thank you, Andy, for inviting me. Thank you, Laura Brown, for being a wonderful interlocutor all these years. And Tasha, I don't know where you went, Tasha. Thank you for everything to make this visit possible, to make my arrival here happen, and to gather us all together. Prelude. I want to sustain wonder. I work and research at the University of Maryland. It's an institution that sits on the ancestral homes of the Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. The University of Maryland, if you haven't been, you should come and visit me, is dotted with buildings that name, but that also forget this indigenous history. Susquehanna Hall, the home of the English department for 20 years, comes from the Lenape for Oyster River. Pocomoke Hall is Algonquin for Blackwater, and it names the Pocomoke people. Anne Arundel Hall, Calvert Hall, St. Mary's Hall. These buildings' names allude to the first 3 counties founded by English colonists in the 17th century. And then there is a dorm, Queen Anne's Hall, named for the 18th century British monarch, an era in which large-scale settler colonialism and genocide devastated the tribal nations in modern-day Maryland. The University of Maryland has taken very modest measures to recognize its indigenous history, an emphasis on modest. It's developed a land acknowledgement, and it's named a new dining hall in Algonquin for meaning a place to go to eat. I was struck a few months ago by a student op-ed which pointed out that absent these substantive actions, these modest measures are performative and that they're lacking. What these measures and what this history also tells us is that the long 18th century, as our colleague Eugenia Zarowski reminds us, isn't over for the people connected to this land. And it's this long 18th century that isn't over, that I'd like to consider this evening. In Dear Science and Other Stories, Catherine McKittrick begins and concludes with wonder. Wonder, she explains in the book's opening pages, is integral to anti-colonial thought and Black studies, and to the interdisciplinary innovation such work requires. Wonder illuminates multiple skills and ways of knowing that privilege collaboration and bring into view unorthodox practices of belonging that discredit ethnic absolutism and its attendant geographic fictions. Wonder is study. It is an analytical frame. McKittrick closes Dear Science in the epistolary, a letter addressed to an addressee named Science, and it ends with a yearning. I want to sustain wonder. Wonder is a noun and it is a verb. A wonder is an object external to the self that induces the feeling of wonder. To wonder is to feel differently, to be astonished as an experience of something unexpected, something unknown, however that might be understood. As a concept, wonder mobilizes expectation, if only to thwart it. 18th century acting manuals give insight into what wonder might look like embodied for the stage, for an audience. The essayist Aaron Hill defines wonder as an inquisitive fear. It is an ebb of spirits rushing back upon the heart, but leaving an alarm upon the muscles that invigorates them toward defense and opposition. John Drummond, the author of The Art of Reading and Speaking in Public, enjoins actors to appear wide-eyed, either staring upwards at the sky or oftener and more expressively fixed on the subject, with the look, all except wildness, of fear. To wonder is to feel disoriented and to be taken away from oneself. To wonder is also a way of inhabiting and knowing the world. My hypothesis is that if we begin with wonder, as McKittrick urges us to do, if we too want to sustain wonder, then we can begin to develop the tools to rethink the epistemological legacies of our own intellectual inheritances. In my comments today, I take up McKittrick's call to argue that wonder is an effective epistemology, and as such, wonder enables the reimagination of what it means to know the natural world and an individual's place in it. Wonder is a way of knowing the world that reminds us that knowing the world is inextricable from being in it. And finally, wonder can even be a critical mode for the reparative intellectual work that we must bring to the field of 18th century studies. Like McKittrick before me, I want to sustain wonder. Wonder and wonders. The 18th century was a world populated by wonders. In occasional pamphlets and broadsides, we learn, for example, that a tree in Hampshire groaned, a little boy had Latin and Hebrew etched in the whites of his eyes, and a woman infected with smallpox found that her legs self-amputated. I can tell you all about these. And in texts we now think of as scientific, we learn that the moon above Dublin bled, that very aged persons in the north of England, of course, the north of England, lived up to 140 years, and that Hans Sloane, the president of the Royal Society, who eventually bequeathed over 71,000 items that formed the basis of the collections for the British Museum, the British Library, and the Natural History Museum, we learned that Sloane spent time analyzing what many took to be a zoophyte, that is, a hybrid between animal and plant, the Tartar lamb. It's at the bottom. These phenomena were all characterized as wonder. These phenomena all likewise induce the feeling of wonder. Wonder as a feeling in the Western tradition has always been inextricable from knowing. Plato and Aristotle identify wonder as the original condition for philosophy. In Plato's great work on the nature of knowledge, he explains that the sense of wonder is the mark of the philosopher. Philosophy indeed has no other origin. Aristotle observes it is owning to their wonder that men now begin and at first began to philosophize. Francis Bacon states early in the 17th century that wonder is the seed of knowledge, though he's very suspicious. He thinks it's a form of self-pleasure and it breaks off and it's tedious. But Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan claims that wonder excites the appetite of knowing the cause. For René Descartes, wonder trains the mind, for it induces close observation. The soul is suddenly taken by surprise, which causes it to consider attentively the objects it finds rare and extraordinary. Wonder ensures that one learns and that one remembers. We can say of wonderment that its particular utility is to enable us to learn and retain in our memory things of which we were formerly unaware. Cartesian wonder is the first passion, the original passion. It has no opposite. It's not merely a feeling of astonishment and surprise, but it is also a distinctly epistemological feeling. The passion of wonder for Descartes is an intellectual mode, a form of knowing. Wonder for Descartes both institutes and demands attention and scrutiny. Wonder's effect is both to produce and retain knowledge of new things. By the late 17th century in Britain, natural philosophers understood wonder as the starting point for scientific inquiry. Robert Boyle, chemist, physicist, founder of the Royal Society, argues that corporeal things such as stars and gems produce wonder, which in turn inaugurates a need for natural philosophical study of them. Joseph Brown's translation of Daniel Leclerc's A Natural and Medicinal History of Worms, bred in the bodies of men and other animals, so it's a glamorous life I lead, these things I read, right, enjoins his dedicatee, John the Duke of Montague, to embrace the wonder that such study promises. Raptures of delight must fill your grace's soul, writes Brown. Wonder and surprise makes you gaze. Brown's language vividly registers a common interweaving of experimentation and marvel, study and feeling, cultivating the experience of wonder as the defining condition of natural philosophy. But this practice was hardly reserved for elite men such as the Duke of Montague. The Eidolon of Charlotte Lennox's The Ladies' Museum from 1760-61, a very popular and wonderful periodical, urges women to take up natural philosophy so that they too might learn from and cultivate wonder. For Boyle, wonder can be productive insofar as it provokes the observer to study and learn. But as soon as one acquires knowledge, that is, as soon as one comes to understand a natural phenomenon, that wonder disappears. For Boyle, the duration of wonder must be limited, and it is. He imagines a sequence in which knowledge displaces wonder. But the way that Boyle explains this process reveals a peculiarity. He explains that our wonder is allayed by a kind of secret reproach grounded on that very wonder. With this narrowing, it becomes clear that for Boyle, the feeling of wonder is coterminous with skepticism. Evident in the words allayed and secret reproach, when one feels wonder, one also feels the imperative to eradicate it. This is not what Joseph Addison praises very excitedly in The Spectator as a secret pleasure of wonder, but it's a secret reproach. Boyle's wonder, what he characterizes and defines as scientific wonder, from the moment it begins, enfolds a wariness about its validity altogether. If many in the Western tradition imagine that wonder is the seed of knowledge, then Boyle imagines that this sequence also moves in reverse. Knowledge is the death knell of wonder. Wonder is veneration. The context for Boyle's scientific work, indeed for all scientific work during this period, is the intellectual and religious framework of physico-theology. Natural philosophy thrives as the study of second, not first causes. As Charlotte Lennox explains, careful observation of the natural world leads to a profound and humble appreciation of the divine. In the minutest animals, we perceive the care and wisdom of an infinite power exerted for their formation and protection. Perceptions possible because of natural philosophy, but conclusions that reflect the glory of God. In Lennox's exaltation, what an awe and adoration ought it to turn our thoughts towards the great creator of them all. John Dennis, reflecting upon astronomy, finds that the more admirable ideas and a more admirable spirit show the attributes of the creator. And even studying worms, Joseph Brown assures his dedicatee, the Duke, and by extension us, that this study culminates in an admiration of the creator. Natural philosophical praxis for these thinkers must always promote this humility of faith. The importance of physico-theology explains the rather peculiar opening to Boyle's of veneration of the high veneration of man's intellect owes to God. It's from 1685, and it predates by 5 years his much more famous work and discussion in The Christian Virtuoso, 1690. And of the high veneration, Boyle begins by expressing indignation that many men, and some of them divines too, presume to talk of him and his attributes as freely and unpremeditatedly, as if they were talking of a geometrical figure or a mechanical engine. These many men, and some of them divines too, are what Boyle elsewhere labels suti empirics, an adjective-noun combination that denigrates doubly both as foul and fraudulent. Sooty, of course, means dirty, but it also means a practitioner who's not licensed. A quack. Boyle indicts the free, spontaneous talk because discussions of the divine take on the tenor of scientific discussions. The presumption and inconsiderateness of these men means that contemplating the divine is rhetorically analogous to the knowing of natural philosophy, an incommensurate parallel that Boyle contends verges on blasphemy. The similarity of rhetoric reveals to Boyle a similarity of epistemology that is not only inappropriate and inaccurate, but also dangerous. Such free, spontaneous talk at once explicitly excuse humility and implicitly promotes arrogance. But when Boyle attacks discussions of the divine as similar to discussions of a geometrical figure or a mechanical engine, he's impugning natural philosophy, a praxis to which he is likewise committed. Why? With this odd analogy, Boyle lays the groundwork for the treatise's argument that wonder must be experienced in the service of an ethical hierarchy, which itself cannot be imagined separate from a social hierarchy. For Boyle, wonder threatens simultaneously to demean humans and to inflate the value of creatures of a nature very much inferior to ours. To avoid what he views as an inversion of the natural order of humans above animals, Boyle pivots to the hierarchy of human and divine to state what wonder ought to be. Contemplating, discussing, and aspiring to know God demands wonder. And yet this wonder for and about the divine must be conjoined with veneration. Boyle explains the divine cause or author of them, the natural phenomenon, deserves our highest wonder and veneration. Veneration, of course, is both a feeling and an action. It is a feeling of deep respect and reverence directed towards some person or thing, and the action or fact of showing respect and reverence. Veneration positions an individual in an inferior relation to something else. Wonder and veneration privileges rank and hierarchy and demands human submission and inferiority to the divine. in the process sharply clamping down on the potential for wonder to introduce and make available other forms of relations, be they affective, social, or epistemological. Within the context of physico-theology, Boyle's claim coheres. Although wary, Boyle does not renounce wonder, but instead insists upon a strict understanding of its purpose. The study of the natural world requires a form of wonder that cannot be separated from, and indeed must culminate in, human veneration for and subjection to the divine. The collective focus of natural philosophers ought to be on those notices that are apt to increase their knowledge of God and consequently their veneration for him. The inextricability of wonder and veneration in Boyle's imagination points to the ethical implications of wonder. And that ethical implication, that wonder is fundamentally about social relations, is clear in Robert Hooke's contemporaneous discussion of the magic lantern. What I see in the case of the magic lantern, as I'll discuss in a moment, is a revelation of how the experience of wonder can be manufactured and cultivated, and in the process, how the experience of wonder may be used to institute social and knowledge hierarchies. Here's some pictures, White. Have a drink. Yeah. This one's great. It's a minotaur. It's on the cover of Jill Casseed's book. It's a good book. A descendant of the camera obscura, the magic lantern is a concave mirror positioned behind a candle with a lens in front that projects images on the wall. Much of the instrument's history is a history producing the experience of wonder, a purpose that Hooke shared. In a discussion in Phil's Trans from August 1668, Hooke explains that the effects are not only very delightful, but also very wonderful. The affective experience the magic lantern produces encompasses an ever-widening range of feelings, including all those passions of love, fear, reverence, honor, and astonishment. Yet who can experience this affective journey is important in Hooke's formulation. He explicitly argues that this process is available only to the uninitiated spectator, that is, individuals who do not know the contrivance and who are not well versed in optics. They are neither the foolish nor the wise, as Isaac Watts explains. He's a mid-century or early 1720s dissenting minister who wrote a treatise on passions, really following Descartes. But he identifies, and this is a way to, it's good for us to remember, those most primed to the effects of wonder are persons of a middle rank or genius. That's us, right? Hooke pointedly links his exegesis of the production of wonder to the magic lantern's potential as an instrument of duplicity, rather than of education or insight, which the examples that I had up before, the idea that one can trace, one can learn botany, one can learn astronomy through the magic lantern existed just as much as this contemporaneous idea that it's an instrument of duplicity. But for Hooke, and this is really interesting because Hooke, curator of experiments at the Royal Society, he imagines a pre-Christian use of the technology. And in so doing, he ignores the fact that the magic lantern is a 16th, 17th century innovation. In his description, he uses the power of the subjunctive to inaugurate his own speculation. Had the heathen priests of old been acquainted with it, their oracles and temples would have been much more famous for the miracles of their imaginary deities. Hooke imagines myriad images with the divine, diabolical, human, and animal seemingly enlivened as in a motion picture, familiar for us, but each emerging as apparitions and vanishing in a cloud. And he spends a lot of time describing this visual phenomenon. But it's a counterfactual, subjunctive history that envisages an optical instrument as a tool for trickery, a technology that subjects viewers and leaves them in awe. Indeed, you can read his description and advocacy for the magic lantern as an indictment of scientific instrumentation more generally. And this is a man who defended to the death the fact that microscopes don't create but reveal. It's a very big problem for him. The wonder that Hooke imagines in this moment is not the wonder that precipitates natural philosophical study, but instead it's an effect that leaves a viewer powerless, duped into believing projections are real. Now, the scenario of heathen priests of old would seem to distance the magic lantern from contemporary usage, but he takes the opposite position. Within the pages of Phil's trance, the magic lantern is still an instrument that divides viewers between those who know its secret and those who do not. In this regard, we learn contemporaries are no different from the heathen priests of old who have duped congregants, if they could have. Remember, that's all subjunctive. Hooke explains at length that one must obfuscate so that the means how such apparitions are made shall not be discoverable. The practitioner must keep the apparatus from view, that it may not be perceived by the company in the room. Only then may the whole operation be easily performed. Hooke reveals that the purpose of the magic lantern is to create two audiences, dividing those few who know its science and mechanics from those who are subjected to the wonder of its apparition and in awe from its effects. This division creates social hierarchies, and it also creates inequitable access to knowledge production. The magic lantern is an instrument of secret knowledges. This is, in other words, scientific instrumentation designed to produce and cultivate wonder for a collective that is imagined as distinct from a smaller group with greater power. For the majority, that is, those who know nothing or little about optics, refraction, or reflection, their wonder is the wonder of not knowing. Hooke's magic lantern reveals the construction of a collective of the middling sort, instituted through its exclusion from and subordination to an elite minority. The story of the magic lantern reveals that the potential to cultivate wonder in others is also the potential to exert control over others, whether that be intellectual, ideological, or something else altogether. Wonder as reimagining. But what happens when wonder does not dissipate into natural philosophical knowledge, or lead to veneration, or to diversion? In other words, I'm curious, why is wonder so difficult and dangerous for someone like Boyle or for someone like Hooke? What happens, in other words, when wonder becomes a mode of apprehending the world that makes available other possibilities, reimaginings that refuse the status quo or more? Recall my original evocation of McKendrick, who imagines wonder as an analytic, as offering ways of knowing that privilege collaboration and bring into view unorthodox practices of belonging that discredit ethnic absolutism and its attendant geographic fictions. I see McKittrick's work in relation to scholars working in other contexts, but towards similarly reparative ends. Julieta Singh offers Unthinking Mastery, which reimagines humanism to refuse the logics of subjection upon which colonial epistemologies and systems depend. And Candace Chu teaches us that illiberal humanisms are directed toward the protection and flourishing of people and ways of being and knowing and of inhabiting the planet that liberal humanism, wrought through the defining structures of modernity, tries so hard to extinguish. McKittrick, Singh, and Chu call us to the urgency of reimagining ways of knowing and in equal measure ways of being. And in this local instance, ways of being scholars, ways of being teachers, and ways of being citizens. Inspired by their work, I posit that we have missed how wonder has the potential to reveal and enable forms of knowing that activate the imagination, refuse the hierarchies of similitude, and make way for the epistemological and political possibilities of difference. This is precisely the radical potential of wonder that Adam Smith begins to explore, and I want to emphasize he begins to explore. He does not fully elaborate, but there's a spark here. In his mid-18th century essay, The History of Astronomy. What is new and singular excites that sentiment, which in strict propriety is called wonder. For Smith, wonder is an intellectual experience occurring when the imagination and memory exert themselves to no purpose, and when they fluctuate to no purpose from thought to thought, and we remain still uncertain and undetermined where to place it or what to think of it. For Smith here, as with Descartes the previous century, wonder is an occasion of when ordinary knowing fails, and when other ways of knowing begin to emerge. The mind, Smith explains, endeavors to find out something which may fill up the gap, which, like a bridge, may so far at least unite those seemingly distant objects. Something. So much hinges on that word. The term something resists figuration and specificity. You could argue that it's nothing and everything all at once. Wonder emerges when resemblance fails, when the connection between two objects is no longer smooth and natural and easy. And the experience of wonder is this perception of difference. For Smith, our minds make sense of things through acts of classification, even though, this is a wonderful qualification, even though we often know more about them than about it. We don't know enough about the classification or the object, but we put them all into order. Smith explains that claiming these resemblances both activates and requires the imagination. In these feats of knowing, and Smith means ordering things in this instance, we are apt to fancy that by being able to do so, we show ourselves to be better acquainted with it and to have a more thorough insight into its nature. With the phrase, we are apt to fancy, Smith's attention to pleasure and the imagination as constitutive to knowing unexpectedly reveals that wonder, imagined by Boyle as something ultimately to reject, persists in the seemingly rationalized Enlightenment formulations of epistemology. For Smith, wonder maintains difference, requires the mind to animate the imagination, and produces a form of knowing that refuses classificatory impulses. The stop, which is thereby given to the career of the imagination, the difficulty which it finds in passing along such disjointed objects, and the feeling of something like a gap or interval betwixt them, constitute the whole essence of this emotion. The stop, the difficulty, the feeling of something like a gap or interval, these are the qualities of wonder. They are, more precisely, the space-time of wonder, that is, the moment and the place where identity cannot happen, where difference dominates, and where the knowability of the self is fundamentally defined by the experience of not knowing the external world. When wonder makes possible an alternative epistemology, it also enables an alternative subjectivity in which difference is not rejected nor problem to be flattened, but instead the defining productive model for not only knowledge but also social relations. Luce Irigaray elaborates this potential. One of my favorite lines of hers, she says, "We need to reread Descartes a little." Just a little, a skosh, and points to the connection between wonder as an effective epistemology and a political relation. The first passion is indispensable not only to life, but also or still to the creation of an ethics. Wonder is the self's awareness of both not being alone and of being in relation to other things. And for Sarah Ahmed, because of its status as the first passion, wonder is about learning to see the world as something that does not have to be, as something that came to be over time and with work. Wonder does not evaporate on the way to disciplinary mastery, but is instead a core mode of political being. By imagining collectivity through wonder, Ahmed locates it as fundamentally constitutive of ethical relations. Like McKittrick before me, I want to sustain wonder. Reading with wonder. As I've been at work on this project, and this has been a COVID project, as I've been at work on this project, and as I've talked about the radical potential of wonder as a mode of thinking and a mode of being, a friend and a mentor, and if you know her, you won't be surprised, distinguished university professor emerita Mary Helen Washington asked me over dinner, "But who gets to wonder?" Her question lingers. The case of the magic lantern in the imagination of Hooke's practice demonstrates how one might cultivate the experience of wonder, while just as powerfully refuses wonder's possibilities for a more radical epistemology and a more just sociability. But what of those emancipatory possibilities that Smith gestures to, though he never fully develops? But who gets to wonder prompts me to return to my archive. It took me about a year to be able to answer her. I can point to some instances. Margaret Cavendish's 1653 poem, A World in an Earring, invites the reader to perceive a plurality of worlds that the wearer cannot. An earring round may well as zodiac be, wherein a sun goes round, which we don't see. Through this fiction, Cavendish mobilizes the grammar of wonder, turning on the subjunctive mood in the word may, and teaching us to scrutinize something without vision. When Cavendish writes out of that subjunctive may, she writes into being wonder as a form of knowledge production. Elizabeth Carter does this with astronomy, James Thomson with Newtonian optics, John Arbuthnot with hematology. But this list, too, is incomplete. I must read again, and I must read with and through wonder. And there in the words of Equiano, I see wonder. His extraordinary description in the middle passage in the interesting narrative resounds with astonishment and terror, detailing and accumulating the inhumane conditions into which his enslaved Africans were forced. It is, in Equiano's words, a scene of horror almost inconceivable. Equiano was a little boy of 11 years old, surrounded by death and dying. He was stolen. He was subjected to the ontological violence of saltwater slavery's transformation of him from boy, son, brother into chattel. The cruelties of saltwater slavery are not only multiple, they multiply, with copious, seemingly innumerable effects for enslaved Africans caught in its machinery. Physical and emotional suffering, a perpetual state of alarm and subjugation, the destruction of kith and kin. Equiano's account graphically captures the casual brutality of the enslavers and the systemic violence of saltwater slavery. The enslaver sailors are just as likely to flog an enslaved African for refusing to eat as they are to throw leftover fish overboard rather than give it to the starving enslaved Africans watching them. In the middle passage, on the ship, and a scene of horror almost inconceivable, there would seem to be no time or space for wonder. And yet, Equiano wonders. In the middle of his account, Equiano turns to a piece of navigational equipment, a scientific instrument, that will later shape his lived experience as a sailor. During our passage, I first saw flying fishes, which surprised me very much. They used frequently to fly across the ship, and many of them fell on the deck. I also now first saw the use of the quadrant. I had often, with astonishment, seen the mariners make observations with it, and I could not think what it meant. They at last took notice of my surprise, and one of them, willing to increase it, as well as to gratify my curiosity, made me look one day through it. The clouds appeared to me to be land, which disappeared as they passed along. This heightened my wonder, and I was now more persuaded than ever that I was in another world and that everything about me was magic. At last we came in sight of the island of Barbados, at which the whites on board gave a great shout and made many signs of joy to us. Equiano's scene of wonder begins with an imagistic correspondence to the fish the enslaver sailors withhold earlier from the enslaved Africans. These fish now fly, as do the clouds, turning Equiano's attention from the despair and cruelty of the slave ship to the openness and heightened possibilities of the ocean sky. Equiano's curiosity prefaces a brief, fleeting fissure in the hegemony of saltwater slavery, during which he takes up the Davis quadrant, it's also called the backstaff. As he sees with the instrument, he sees what he then takes for land in front of him, disappearing from sight, a phenomenon that induces wonder. This heightened my wonder. The retrospective quality of the interesting narrative enables Equiano to explain away that misapprehension as mistaking clouds for land while maintaining the sense of awe that he experienced, qualities that lead him to imagine himself in another world where everything about me was magic. That other world comes to be punctured by the ship's arrival, temporally in the narrative, grammatically in the next sentence, to the slave colony of Barbados. And that slave colony of Barbados, as Equiano implicitly reminds readers, is likewise a port in the history of British navigation. In 1763, 25 years before the publication of the interesting narrative, the British government assigned the astronomer and mathematician Neville Maskelyne the task of sailing to Barbados to test 3 devices that were designed to measure longitude, the final chapter in the decades-long response to the 1714 Longitude Act with its £10,000 reward. The histories of longitude, colonization, and chattel slavery are what Lisa Lowe calls the intimacy of modern Western liberalism and the global conditions upon which it depends. Equiano's Wonder reveals the colonial intimacy of wonder, scientific practice, saltwater slavery, and the literary imagination. Coda. I want to leave you with these brief thoughts. Wonder is more than something we stumble across in our research, though it is that. Wonder as a theme, as a concept, as a hermeneutic, reorients time and space, both for the writers who imagine it and for those who read with it. And this reorienting, it offers us a way to see that the world as it is not the world as it must be. Wonder can help us develop an intellectual and ethical approach that we can and that we ought to bring to the materials we study, helping us to apprehend the multiple and multiplying intimacies of literature and science, self and other, knowledge and feeling, in the long 18th century and today. Thank you.
The 7 Years' War was approximately 1756 to 1763. Do you view that as bearing on this, the context for this work?
The 7 Years' War, can you be more specific?
Well, you quoted several scientists and a fair amount of technology. Do you view that as part of the arms race between England and France in the 18th century?
Well, longitude is, certainly.
What is?
Longitude?
Longitude.
Yeah. So in 1714, the Parliament announced a competition awarding £10,000 to anyone who could definitively perceive and measure longitude on a ship at sea. And the problem with that technology, obviously, is that we can measure time and space when we're on land, but when you're in the ocean, it becomes much more problematic and much more difficult. And there's actually another project that I have. There's a mathematician, Jane Squire, who petitioned, had all sorts of calculations, and she pretty much figured it out. But the parliamentary committees were as corrupt as what's going on at 10 Downing Street today. No one would give her an audience. It was kind of through favoritism and all of that. So, but if you could realize that that was announced in 1714, and it's not until, it takes 50 years for this final competition. And what's striking about the role of Barbados and Britain and the long literary, colonial, economic, and exploitative history is that the test for longitude, that final test, taking these 3 different scientific objects, instruments, is imagined as going from London to Barbados and going to the port of call that is at the heart of the sugar trade and the extractive practices that really made England very wealthy. So the 7 Years' War is a kind of a bit of a different context, but certainly longitude and really thinking about how science and the history of instruments develop certain kinds of technologies that allow a state to control others, I think is very important and interesting. A side example that is in the book, but not here, but compared to the Magic Lantern, there's, if anyone knows the Female American, it's this great Robinson Aid, and this young, half indigenous, half English woman finds herself swept up on a deserted island, and she comes across this statue and she decides in her imperial way that she's going to control the indigenous peoples who come to visit. And the statue is actually a microphone. And so she uses it to preach Christianity, and they all kind of awe. So something like even in something like the Female American, which has a lot of really interesting progressive possibilities, it's always yanked. So our inheritance, my point is our inheritance is very bifurcated. And the 18th century is so important because there are lots of liberatory potential, but also a lot of extractive colonial systems that were put into place.
Thank you.
That's my short answer. Hi, yeah, Andy.
I'm back on Adam Smith.
Yeah.
Really interesting appearance here. I haven't read that work, and I always have trouble reconciling the things he did before The Wealth of Nations with what he does in The Wealth of Nations, and it makes me think about the question of that you raised about wonder from kind of two angles. One is the sort of, well, if I can put it this way, sort of vulnerable, exploratory, having your expectations exceeded, and that's wonderful, right? But then on the other side is sort of the disenchanted view, like this is trickery, this is what you set up to, and then here's the real wheels and so on. And so Smith, when I try, and this is just really just spitballing some ideas, but when I see Smith speculating on the unknowability of the block to the imagination and so on, it's so very different from what he does in The Wealth of Nations, where it's extremely disenchanting, really. I mean, it's like everything becomes reduced to productive labor versus unproductive labor, and that unproductive labor would certainly include this kind of writing. So how, does he present maybe in his kind of span some of the two sides of this, the way I would take, you sort of end up with wonder in the wonderful mode, but there was all the disenchanted, magic lantern mode, and I'm trying to, I guess, put those pieces together, and I'm thinking about him as an example of somebody who's kind of moving through some different positions in that. I don't know.
No, thanks for bringing up Smith, because he's also a theory of moral sentiments. I mean, he's a complicated guy, a very, very complicated guy. And this piece is early. It's 1748. It's early for him. I think that when it comes to capital, and when it comes to morality, and this wouldn't fit into either one of those. The systemization becomes very concrete. I mean, theory of moral sentiments is really about how to feel sympathy without changing anything. And that's part of, the rise of sensibility is so pernicious because it argues through the pathetic example. So you weep when you see, the prisoner in the jail, but you actually don't, attack poverty, all that. So that's why I really want to emphasize that this is not Smith, a kind of definitive Smith, but it's a tentative opening, and it's easy enough, when I've talked about this, and people who have worked on wonder tend to focus on the fact, which is absolutely true, the fact that you have this global, kind of newly global world where there are objects from all different kinds of corners of the world showing up. So the Lamb of Tartar, right, exactly. So curiosities and wonders. And that is all there, and particularly in the early modern period. But I think one of there's a legacy that is never fully developed in the 18th century. But I think it's in our best interest to develop it now. So that would be Smith is not a precursor. He's very faulty. I mean, he sets up our banking system. He's so much fun to teach to students who are, you realize if you're in a novel, an 18th century novel, you're going to walk out with a banknote and it's going to rain. And you're going to be impoverished, right? So it's so normalized for students today. But this idea of wonder as a space, not just of vulnerability, but of kind of profound connection and generation and I'm speaking to a room of educators, it's the space of the classroom, up until the moment of assessment. Up until that moment. So, all right. So one way or another, we've signed on to this, and then we're very Smithian at the end, right? You either have money in your bank account or you don't. Yeah, sorry. Right, yeah, thanks. Yeah, Laura.
Wonder, of course, is a definitively human feeling or way of knowing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I'm wondering if, or whether you thought of, I'm sure you have thought, what are ways of thinking about wonder, the whole scenario that you're describing in relationship to the other than human?
Yeah.
And I was struck by the passage from Equiano that you're seeking to use as a kind of illustrative explication, because what he's wondering about there are animals, land, and clouds.
Yeah.
It's the fish, and so that the scene of wonder is so powerfully beyond or outside of the human. Anyway, just any thoughts you might have had, or any other examples you might have encountered that put the human and the other than human into either a relationship or a disrelationship.
Yeah, and yes, exactly. I'm thinking of all your work with this, but absolutely, when he's on the ship, and I chose that moment because of the extraordinariness of the middle passage, but he does immediately following when he's in Virginia, he has another moment of wonder that's triggered by a clock, and so in both instances for him, it's some sort of scientific technology, and then a kind of rereading of the world from that. But there are a lot of the examples that I have found that describe wonder are sometimes it's about other kinds of human beings. So there's the whole, and this, in today's world, it's extraordinarily offensive, but the idea of a monstrous birth, which permeates all the scientific literature. But any account of trees, or, I look at Gilbert White and, he's following birds. Then birds, for him, a moment of wonder is when this tiny little bird, the nightjar, lands on a summer house, and with its tiny little sound, shakes the entire thing. So many of the instances that generate wonder tend to be the not human, or the night sky. So Elizabeth Carter's talking about the night sky, that kind of thing. Arbuthnot is fascinating because he says, he's looking at Pascal and through hematology, and he says, but that's not me. All this, the blood coursing through my body. Which of course reminds me when my mother saw an MRI of her brain, and she turned to the neurologist and said, but that doesn't explain my thought. Right, but it's that kind of capturing. But I don't quite name it in the way that you're naming it, but I talk about it, but I should, and I don't talk about it today. But in most instances, it's kind of a study of the natural world in a way, looking at, a tree where the sap can generate another tree can be something. Yeah, thanks. Oh yeah, hi. Sorry.
Thank you so much for this incredible lecture.
Thanks.
I was left wondering, unintended, whether there's any reception. I understand the book to focus on English-speaking 18th century, and I was thinking whether have you come across any references to Vico? Like that was one author that immediately came to mind. Like Shakespeare being like this new epistemology founded on very much, now that I think back to it, founded very much on wonder and the ability that we have to use metaphors and other figures of speech to understand the world as a history of humankind that runs counter to enlightenment, to paraphrase it out earlier. So I was wondering, yes, if you found references to that, or if you deal with that in your book or in your introduction or anything.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, Vico plays a kind of a smaller part, but you're right, it's absolutely very central. For me, Descartes has been very eye-opening because he's really very much a response to the Baconian anxiety that really shapes, and I kind of cut my teeth on the late 17th century discourses around the Royal Society. But this book is really the book that I did with Stanford, I wasn't finished yet. I realized that, a friend of mine said, so you're going from imagination to wonder? Like, when are you just, enough already? But I'm not finished. So one of the key things that I'm very interested in is the extent to which these rationalizations are utterly founded on imaginative acts. But the point of critique, and that's what I'm, who can wonder, the next step. I do all of that in my experimentalism book, but I'm really interested in what we can do with that theoretically today as a way of reading. So thinking of it as a theme, as a concept, but also as a mode of reading, and a mode of, I don't know, but a mode of kind of political collectivity. So that's why I say that this is I was telling Laura over lunch, the horror is that my editor, my God, I will curse this editor till the end of my days, said it's just a short book. So anyway, don't fall for that. But I thought, how can I, talk about the ways in which wonder is fuels such kinds of anxiety, and really what is there, what the problem is. And the problem is, it's like laughter in the 18th century. The problem is it can misfire. It can go in directions. Wonder literally moves bodies. I mean, it takes a person from one place to the next. And that's why as soon as I saw Boyle and veneration, that became so clarifying to me. That's the problem. Wonder's great, but don't you dare wonder in a way that's going to challenge, kind of look back and challenge. But the Vico is absolutely part of this conversation. Yeah, thank you.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for this. Especially for the discussion of Smith, I've been struggling with that particular essay today, so I really appreciated you bringing it up. I had a question regarding how wonder is sometimes used as an almost racialized trope, right? So the idea of the uneducated, and this is similar to what Hooks is saying, but the uneducated, unknowing, quote-unquote, savage who can be fooled through what we understand to be completely logical and by the reader or who's writing. But wonder is this trope of creating a superstitious, like colonial subject often. And so I was curious, for which the Equiano reading was such a lovely corrective or the potential to read otherwise. And I was wondering what wonder does, or how wonder, or if wonder produces, or representing subjects as wondering produces particular racial tropes.
Just go back to, yeah. That's the question. I think that's a fabulous question. And Equiano is an answer to that, but also you can see there are lots of ways in which Equiano can be read as contributing to that. And this larger arc for me is really thinking about kind of one of the other contexts. When I say this is a COVID book, it's also, I know in the ways that I embody the world, and one of the key ways that I embody the world is as a professor and I just cycled off the board of ASEX, the 18th Century Society. So what does it mean to study a field that presents a history of white supremacy? And so what do you do with that, and how are the hierarchies of the material reproduced in the field itself? So I'm writing very much in the consciousness of that. So in thinking about the racialization, wonder had and that Barbara Stafford talks about, lots of people talked about wonder as duping people. And so I'm not unique in that way. I mean, no one talks about Hook quite in that same way, but making a space for it being an informed, I mean, it's hard to say, but kind of an informed, rigorous, plausible subjectivity and set of relations. I think that is what's very important, to take that sensibility to the archive, because the archive is it's reproducing the same, we're reading the archive in the same ways, but we have to read the archive differently. And so we have to read it in the way that Mary Hallen said, but who gets to wonder, and what does that mean? So your question is absolutely right, and I think that's for kind of the field in which I'm situated, it's either that or just wrap everything up and move on. And I think that's an impoverished option for me. But there's no way of continuing with the status quo. Yeah, none.
Thank you so
That's a small thought. Anyway, thank you all so much. Thank you.